Good morning, students. So let's begin today's session. So in the previous class, we have started discussing about the tubular part of the alimentary canal, and before that, we have already taken up with the histology of the alimentary canal, right? And then we moved on into the tubular part of the alimentary canal. So in that, we took up the first part in the previous class, which is the esophagus, right? So today, let's take up with the second one what we have, which is called as the stomach, right? Just a moment. Okay, sorry for that small interruption. So let's begin with the second part of the tubular part of the alimentary canal today, which is called as the stomach, right? So let's begin today's session by taking up with the anatomy of the human stomach. Okay, now talking about the stomach. The stomach is a saccular structure, a sac-like structure, which is present mostly in the abdominal region, right? So the exact location is, it is present towards the left side of the abdomen, right below the diaphragm, right? So yesterday we saw when we were talking about the esophagus, right? So I told you that esophagus is a tubular structure which would run throughout the throat. It would pass through it would pierce through the diaphragm and it would enter into the abdomen. So inside the abdomen or in the abdominal region, we have the esophagus opening up into this sac-like structure, the obliquely placed J-shaped bag or sac-like structure, which is actually called as the stomach, right? So exact location is, it is present towards the left side of the body, right below the diaphragm. So in that curvature of the diaphragm, the anterior part of the stomach actually fits into the curvature of the diaphragm. So this is what we have with the stomach, a sac-like structure that is being present. So let us take up with the structure of the stomach, external structure, then we'll get into the internal structure of the stomach. Say if this is the esophagus, what we have drawn in the previous class, right? So this is the esophagus, right? This esophagus would now open up into this sac-like structure that is actually present, right? It would open up into this sac-like structure, and here we would have this diaphragm being placed, right? So right below the diaphragm, we have the stomach being placed, and again remember, it is not a straight structure, it is an obliquely placed structure present towards the left side of the body. Now, this stomach has two openings, one opening towards the anterior side where the esophagus opens up into the stomach. Second opening is present towards the posterior side where the posterior part of the stomach would open up into the next structure what we are actually going to take up, which is called as the small intestine. So this is the posterior part, posterior opening that is actually being present. So we know what exactly is this anterior opening called as. Yesterday in the previous class, we actually spoke about that. So the anterior opening of the stomach is usually referred to as the esophageal gastric opening. And that esophageal gastric opening, we also saw that it is guarded by a sphincter. Right? The esophageal gastric opening is guarded by a sphincter, and in the previous class we took up that this sphincter is called as the esophageal gastric sphincter. So there is one more name given for it also, we'll just look up to that. Now talking about the different regions of the stomach. Entire stomach could be classified into 4 different regions. The one which is present towards the diaphragm, that is this part that is present towards the diaphragm, the anterior part of the stomach, which is present very close to the diaphragm, it is actually called as the fundus region, or we can also call it as the fundic stomach, right? It is called the fundus part of the stomach or the fundic stomach. The one which is, or the part of the stomach which is completely towards the left side, right? The part of the stomach which is said to be completely towards the left side. So this part of the stomach, we would start calling it as the cardiac stomach, right? It is called as the cardiac part of the stomach, or we can start calling it as the cardiac stomach. Then the main part of the stomach is actually called the body of the stomach. So this would be the body of the stomach, and the posterior end of the stomach, which would open up into the small intestine. So that posterior end is usually referred to as the pyloric stomach, right? The pyloric stomach or the pylorus or the pyloric stomach. So these are the 4 different regions of the stomach what we actually have. Right. So the fundus stomach or the fundic stomach, which is present mostly towards the diaphragm, The second region is called the cardiac stomach, which is completely towards the left side. Then we have the main part, which is the body of the stomach, and then the posterior end would be the pyloric region or the pyloric stomach or the pylorus part of the stomach. Now, as I said, the stomach is guarded by two openings. So there are two openings of the stomach. The anterior opening is what we call it as the esophageal gastric opening, and we said that esophageal gastric opening is guarded by a sphincter. So this sphincter, in the previous class, we started calling it as the esophageal gastric sphincter, and there is one more name also given for it. It is also called as the cardiac sphincter. And cardiac sphincter. Now, this cardiac sphincter, as I've already said in the previous class, it is the one which would start acting like a valve, and this cardiac sphincter, it would prevent the backward flow of the food from the stomach back into the intestine, right? The reason why we start calling it as the cardiac sphincter is because this opening opens up near the cardiac part of the stomach, and that's the reason why we start calling it as the cardiac sphincter. Then there is this posterior opening that is being present, where the stomach opens up into the first part of the small intestine, which is actually referred to as the duodenum. Right. So this opening is actually called the gastric duodenal opening, and this gastric duodenal opening is also guarded by a sphincter, and there is another sphincter here, which would again prevent the backward flow of food from the intestine back into the stomach. So that sphincter that is present here in between the stomach as well as the duodenal part of the small intestine, we would start calling it as the pyloric sphincter. So we would start calling it as the pyloric sphincter, right? So this pyloric sphincter, again, it is nothing but a circular muscle which would prevent the backward flow of food from the duodenum, that is the duodenal part of the small intestine, back into the stomach, right? So this is what we have in the external structure of the stomach. What we have, basically, it is nothing but a sac-like structure, a J-shaped sac-like structure, which is placed obliquely towards the left side of the body, having four parts present right below the diaphragm, having four parts: the funding part, the cardiac part, the body, as well as the pyloric stomach. And two things what we need to remember: two sphincters are present. One sphincter towards the anterior part of the stomach, which is called as the cardiac sphincter, and one sphincter towards the posterior part of the stomach, which is called as the pyloric sphincter. Function of the sphincter is, again, it would prevent the backward flow of food from anywhere. If it is a cardiac sphincter, it would prevent the backward flow of food from the stomach to the esophagus. If it is a pyloric sphincter, it would prevent the backward flow of the food from the small intestine back into the stomach. So this is the external parts of the stomach, external structure of the stomach what we have. Now let's move towards the internal structure of the stomach. Talking about the internal structure, again, the stomach towards the internal side is again composed of the four layers what we actually saw in the previous session, right? There are again these four layers of stomach which is being present. So the first layer, we know the outermost layer is called the serosa, right? So this is the outermost layer, the serosa region, right? The second layer, we know serosa is, after serosa, we have something called as the muscularis region, right? So there is this muscularis region being present, the second layer. Then the third layer, we know it is nothing but the submucosa, right? It is the submucosa, which is the third layer that is present. And we know the last layer is nothing but the mucosa. So the inner surface of the, or the inner layers of the stomach are these four layers, the outermost layer being the serosa and the innermost layer being the mucosa. In between the serosa and mucosa, again, there is muscularis as well as the submucosa. Now we are very much familiar with what exactly are all of these made up of. Serosa, we know that it is composed of the simple squamous epithelial tissue, what we actually took up in the previous session, right? So that is simple squamous epithelial tissue, where the serosa is made up of. Second one, muscularis. We know there are two muscles present in the muscularis region. One is the longitudinal muscles, the outer longitudinal muscle, and the inner circular muscle. But one characteristic feature of the muscularis region of stomach is, as we have already seen before, there is one additional muscle which is being present, which is called as the oblique muscle. So along with these two muscles, there is another layer which is called the oblique muscle, which is actually present towards the inner side of the circular muscle. So the order goes like this. Outer one will be longitudinal muscles, the middle one will be the circular muscles, and the inner one will be the oblique muscle. This is one additional feature what you need to remember whenever we talk about the muscularis part of the stomach, oblique muscle. Apart from stomach, nowhere in the tubular part of the alimentary canal we would find this oblique muscles being present. Next, talking about the submucosa, We know that the submucosa is composed of the areolar connective tissue or the loose connective tissue. Right, there is this loose connective tissue that is present in the submucosa region, and we know that the mucosa is composed of the epithelial tissue, right? So there are three layers again we took up in the previous class, right? The outermost layer of the mucosa is called the muscular layer, we call it as muscularis mucosae. Then there is a reticular connective tissue, what we call it as the lamina propria, and then the innermost layer is the epithelial tissue. And this epithelial tissue is the one here in the stomach, which would start undergoing modifications such that they would get modified into something called as the gastric glands, right? So let us quickly take up all of these four layers and we'll talk about the gastric glands also, right? Now these gastric glands are the ones which are actually responsible for the secretion of the gastric juices. Now quickly let us put everything together. Outermost layer is the serosa. So here we would have the outermost layer, that is the serosa part, which is composed of thin layer of cells, that is squamous epithelial tissue. Followed by serosa, we know there is muscularis region being present. So muscularis, first one has the longitudinal muscles towards the outer side. Right, so all these would be the longitudinal muscles which are present towards the outer side. Right, so followed by longitudinal muscles, we know that there are these circular muscles which are being present. So these would be the circular muscles that are present, right? Then towards the inner side of the circular muscles, we would have these oblique muscles which are being present. One of the characteristic feature would be this oblique muscles which are being present in case of the stomach part. So this is the serosa, right? So this entire region here would be the muscularis. Then followed by that, we would have the mucosa being present. So here mucosa, which is nothing but a loose connective tissue. All this would be the mucosa, which is the loose connective tissue that is being present. So this region would be the submucosa. And followed by the submucosa, we would have the mucosal region. So we are not showing all the three layers of mucosa, so directly we get into the epithelial tissue part of it. So here we would have the mucosa that is being present, and these would be the cells of the epithelial tissue that is being present. Now, as I've said, some of these cells of the mucosa region would undergo modification such that they would get transformed into something called as the gastric gland. So here we would have some of these cells modifying themselves into the gastric glands. So this is how the gastric glands would actually appear to be. Right, so this would be the gastric gland, what we have actually written up here. So this is the gastric gland, right? So some of the epithelial cells of the mucosa, right? So some of the epithelial cells of the mucosa would modify themselves into gastric glands, and these gastric glands are the ones which are actually responsible for the secretion of the gastric juice, which plays an important role in the process of digestion, right? So talking about the gastric gland, so the gastric gland is said to be a tubular gland, right? A few things you can make a note about gastric gland, right? So the gastric gland, it is said to be a tubular gland. That is, we know what we mean by a tubular gland and a saccular gland. So glands could be classified into two types based on the shape. If it is a sac-like gland, we would start calling it as a saccular gland. If it is a tube-like gland, we would start calling it as a tubular gland. So here, the gastric gland is actually said to be a tubular gland, right? Then it is also said to be a branched gland, but the type of branching here is said to be simple branch, right? It is a simple branched gland, right? So the gastric glands, in case of humans, right, which is present in the stomach, is said to be a tubular gland, and it is also said to be a simple branched gland. The reason why we call it as a simple branch is there is no extensive branching seen. It is just a very simple branching, as we have actually shown. Right now, there are different types of cells present in the gastric glands. So let us quickly see what are those different types of cells that are present in the gastric gland. What are those secretions, or what secretions are seen from those cells of the gastric gland, and also we'll start discussing about the role of those particular secretions. Right. So let us take up with the gastric gland, and we'll see what are the different types of cells which are present in the gastric gland. So there are almost 5 to 6 different types of cells which are a part of gastric gland. So you need to know about all of those cells and their functions also. So I'm just slightly changing the diagram here, so that we try to understand where exactly the cells are actually being present. So what we are doing is we are just whatever diagram we have taken up now, just inverting it so that we get a clear picture of the gastric gland. Say this is the cells what we are actually talking about, and here we would have this gastric gland that is being present, and all these would be the cells. And remember, all of these are the columnar epithelial cells. Right? So here also we would have this columnar epithelial cells. Right? And here we would have this gastric gland, right, which would actually show this sort of a branching. Right? As we have said, it is a simple branched cells that are actually being present. So it is a tubular gland. A simple branched gland is what we call it as a gastric gland. Now let us talk about the different types of cells that are being present. Number one, the first type of cell that is present are said to be called as the goblet cells. So here, we'll be using different colors, so we'll be able to indicate those type of cells. So here we would have these mucus secreting glands which are being present. So the structure of mucus secreting gland would actually be like this. So that's the reason why I'm drawing it here like this. So everywhere we would have the mucus secreting cells which are being present. So this is the first type of cell what we have, the mucus secreting cell. So everywhere again towards the inner side also we would have this mucus secreting cells being present. So all these would be the mucus secreting cells which are actually a part of the gastric gland. So in most of the places we would have the mucus being secreted. Right? So this would be the first type of cell. And this cell here, we will just write it down here. So this cell what we have written down here would be the goblet cells. Right? So this is the first type of cell what we have, which is called the goblet cells. And we know what is the role of goblet. Goblet cells are the ones which are nothing but mucus secreting cells which are actually present throughout the gastric gland. Right. The second type of cells what we have are called as the large cells. So they are said to be larger cells which are actually present towards the outer side of the glands like this. So these would be the larger cells which are present towards the outer side, and all of these secretions would actually be poured again into the gland. Right? So these would be the larger cells that are actually present here. And these larger cells, we would start calling these larger cells as, so this would be our second type of cell, which is called as the oxymic cells. Right? So this is the second cell, which is called the oxymic cells, what we actually have. Right? Next, moving on to the third type of cell. After oxymic cell, the third type of cell what we have, right? The third type of cell. So we'll first take down the cells, then we'll see what is their secretion, and simultaneously we'll take up the functions also. So the third type of cells are the ones which are actually present everywhere here. So I'm just indicating it with this color. So all these, again, remember, all of the cells are all said to be columnar epithelial cells. So these are the cells what we are actually drawing up here. So these would be the third type of cells which are actually being present. And the third type of cells that are present here, we would start calling them as the chief cells. Right? We start calling them as the chief cells. So this is the third type of cell that is being present, which is called the chief cells. Then we have the fourth type of cells. So these cells are actually said to be triangular shaped cells. Right? So they are said to be large triangular shaped cells which are actually present. So here we would have these large triangular shaped cells which are being present, and these large triangular shaped cells we would start calling them as the argent-different cells. Argent-different cells. So these are the fourth type of cells what we have drawn, the argent-different cells, right? So goblet cell is number one, oxymic cell number two, then we have the chief cells being number three, then we would have the argent-different cells being cell number 4. Right. Now, along with these 4 cells, there are other cells also which are being present. And the next type of cell, what we want to do is all present here. Right. So we would have these cells being present here. So these cells are called as the G cells. Right. So all these, what I have done in purple, so they are all said to be the G cells. Right. So this would be our cell number 5, which is called as the G cells. Right. So cell number 5 is the G cells. And finally, we have one more type of cell, and that type of cell is the one which is present throughout here. So it's all covered up here completely. And these cells, and in between we would have the mucus cells also being present, right? So all of these cells, what I have drawn here, would be cell number 6, and that cell number 6 is called the basal cells. Right? So these are the 6 different types of cells that are actually a part of the gastric gland. So all these 6 types of cells together, we would actually start calling it as the gastric gland, right? So cell number 1, there is mucus secreting cell, which is called the goblet cells. Cell number 2, we have something called as the oxymic cells. Number 3, there is something called as the chief cells. Number 4, there is argentophane cells. And number 5, there is something called as the G cells. And number 6, we would have these cells which are called as the basal cells. Now let us take up with each of these cells and let us see what are those secretions of those cells, what do they secrete, and let us take up with the function of those particular cells. So let us begin with the first one. The first type of cell, what we told, is called as the goblet cells. Right, the goblet cells. Now what is the role of this goblet cells? Goblet cells are the ones which would actually secrete the mucus. They are nothing but, as we have already said, they are nothing but mucus secreting cells. We would start calling them as goblet cells. Now, what is the role of the mucus being secreted by the goblet cells? So, the mucus secretion by the goblet cells is mostly for protection, right? For protection. So, we can just break down the function of it also. So, the function of mucus would be protection. So, it would protect the lining of the stomach. Right, it would protect the lining of the stomach. So that is the role of the mucus which is being secreted by the goblet cells. Now, how exactly is, or why exactly is the stomach lining has to be protected? Because we know that in the stomach there is this highly concentrated hydrochloric acid being secreted. Right, highly concentrated HCl. It is so concentrated that even if a single drop of that concentrated HCl falls on our skin, our entire skin will burn. Highly acidic. The pH usually ranges from 1.2 to 1.8. So you can just imagine how highly concentrated it is, right? How highly acidic it is. So as and when HCl is being secreted in the stomach, there are 100% chances that this HCl will start damaging the lining of the stomach. So to prevent that, there is this mucus that is being secreted. So this mucus starts acting as a thick wall around the lining of the stomach, such that the HCl is not concentrated, HCl is not able to act on the stomach wall, so that the stomach wall could be highly protected. So that is the role of the mucus which is being secreted by the goblet cells. So goblet cells, it would secrete mucus. The function of mucus is to protect the lining of the stomach. Next, we have the second type of cell what we have. The second type of cell what we said is called the oxymic cells. Now, this oxymic cells, they would secrete 2 types of substances, right? They would secrete 2 types of substances. Number 1, they would start secreting concentrated hydrochloric acid, right? They would start secreting concentrated hydrochloric acid. Now, what is the role of this concentrated hydrochloric acid? There are different functions of HCl. So, let us take up those functions and see what would be the role of HCl. Number 1, HCl is involved in, right? HCl is involved in maintaining the acidic pH of the stomach. It maintains the acidic pH or maintains the acidic nature of the stomach. Now, why this acidic nature of the stomach has to be maintained? Because there are some enzymes which are being secreted by the stomach, right? By some of the cells of the stomach. We'll see what are those enzymes also. If those enzymes has to act, they require a highly acidic pH. Only in the acidic pH, those enzymes will be able to perform their duties efficiently. So, for that, HCl starts maintaining the acidic nature of the stomach by secreting a highly concentrated hydrochloric acid. That is the first function. Second function of HCl is also involved in smoothing of the food. So it makes the food smoothing of the food. So as and when the food from the buccal cavity enters into the stomach, the HCl secretion, what it does is it starts smoothing the food. Right? It starts making the food smoother so that the further process of digestion would be favored because of the smoothened food which is being formed in the stomach. The third function of HCl is, this is the major function of HCl, it is responsible for activation of enzymes. right? It is responsible for the activation of enzymes. So there are two prominent enzymes which are being secreted by the stomach. And remember, those enzymes are actually secreted in their inactive form. So for those enzymes to act on the substrate, that is the food that we eat, they have to be activated. So if at all they have to be activated, this HCl secretion is very, very important, because HCl is the one which is responsible for activation of those enzymes. So without HCl, there is no activation happening of the enzymes. If there is no activation of enzymes happening, there is no digestion taking place in the stomach. That important is HCl. And one more last function we can take up. HCl is also involved in defense mechanism. Right? It also plays a role in defense mechanism. So how exactly defense mechanism? Say if any of the microorganisms enters into the food, and if we start consuming those microorganisms which have been, if we start consuming the food which has been contaminated by microorganisms, and if that food along with the microorganisms enters into the stomach, upon the action of HCl, the microorganisms will not be able to survive. So what exactly HCl is doing? HCl is bringing about the destruction of those microorganisms which would enter into the stomach along with the food that we eat. Therefore, it plays a major role in defense mechanism. Right? So 4 functions we have seen with regards to HCl. And remember, HCl is being secreted by the second type of cell what we have on the list, which is called the oxymic cell. The second substance which is being secreted by the oxymic cell, it is called as Cassell's intrinsic factor. We start calling this the Cassell's intrinsic factor. Now, what is the role of this Cassell's intrinsic factor? Cassell's intrinsic factor is majorly involved in the absorption of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 is nothing but cyanocobalamin, right? Cyanocobalamin, vitamin B12. So for the absorption of vitamin B12 in the food that we eat, this factor plays a very, very important role. Now, what is the importance of vitamin B12 or cyanocobalamin? Vitamin B12 is very, very essential for the process of erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis is nothing but the formation of RBC. For the formation of RBC, vitamin B12 is very, very essential. So for absorption of vitamin B12 in the food that we eat, this Cassell's intrinsic factor plays a very important role. So if there is no Cassell's intrinsic factor, there is no absorption of vitamin B12. If there is no absorption of vitamin B12, what would happen? The process of RBC formation or red blood corpuscle synthesis would actually be interrupted. Right? So this is the importance of the Cassell's intrinsic factor, the second substance which is being secreted by the second type of cell, which is called as the oxymic cells. Right? So goblet cells, they will secrete mucus. Oxymic cells, they will secrete HCl as well as the Cassell's intrinsic factor. Now let's take up with the third cell what we have. The third cell what we have is called the chief cell. There is one more name given for oxymic cell. It is also called as parietal cells. So let us make a note of this also. It is also called as the parietal cells. Either we call it as oxymic cell or we call it as the parietal cell. Okay, now let's move on to the third type of cell. The third type of cell is called the chief cell. Right? We call it as chief cells. And there is one more name given for chief cells also. It is also called as the zymogen cells. Either we call it as chief cells or zymogen cells. Now, these chief cells are the ones which are responsible for secretion of enzymes, right? So there are two very prominent enzymes which are being secreted by the chief cells. Number one, the first enzyme that is being secreted by them is called as the pepsinogen. Right? So this is the first enzyme which is called pepsinogen. Again, pepsinogen is said to be an inactive enzyme. Right? Pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme. For the activation of pepsinogen, we require this HCl being secreted. That's the reason why we said here one of the functions is activation of enzyme. Which enzyme? Enzymes which are being secreted by the chief cells. The second enzyme also is said to be an inactive enzyme, which is called as proteolytic. So this is the second enzyme, which is also said to be an inactive enzyme, right? So the chief cells or the zymogen cells, they would start secreting these two inactive enzymes, which are called as pepsinogen and proteolytic. Both of these enzymes, first, there is activation of pepsinogen happening by HCl. So pepsinogen will be activated into its active form, which is called as pepsin. And once pepsin gets activated, that activated pepsin will now start activating prorenin into its active form, which is called as renin. So that if these two enzymes has to be activated, HCl plays a very important role. Now, both of these enzymes, the function of both of these enzymes, right? Both of these enzymes, we would actually start calling them as proteolytic enzymes. So they are usually referred to as the proteolytic enzymes. Now, what does this mean, proteolytic enzymes? Proteolytic is enzymes which break down proteins, right? So enzymes which break down proteins, we would start calling them as proteolytic enzymes. So pepsinogen starts acting on almost all of the proteins that are present, whereas prorenin, after its activation into renin, it specifically targets the milk protein, which is called as casein. Right? It will specifically target the milk protein called as the casein. So that is the role of these two enzymes. Now, along with this, there is one more enzyme also which is being secreted by the chief cell, but its activity in the stomach is said to be very, very mild. And that's the reason why we start calling it as mild gastric lipase. So we will start calling it as the mild gastric lipase. Lipase is nothing but enzymes which break down lipid or fat. But again, we are using the term called mild here because if lipase has to act on the fats, right? If lipase has to act on the fat, they require alkaline pH, which is not provided in the stomach. That's the reason why lipase activity is said to be maximum in the small intestine, where a complete alkaline nature is being maintained. So that's the reason why there is mild gastric lipase. We use the term called as mild gastric lipase because the activity of lipase is said to be very, very less. Sometimes we can say it is negligible also because of the acidic, completely acidic nature of the stomach what we have. So this is the third type of cell, which is called the chief cell or the zymogen cell. Now talking about the fourth type of cell, what we have. Cell number 4. Fourth type of cell is called the Argent-Tuffen cells. We have the Argent-Tuffen cell. Now talking about the Argent-Tuffen cells. Argent-Tuffen cells secretes something called as serotonin. Right? They will secrete something called a substance which is called as serotonin. Now, this serotonin is one which is actually responsible. There are different functions of serotonin. Right? There are a lot of functions of serotonin. Some places it will start acting as a neurotransmitter. All different functions are there. Right? So here, serotonin, which is being secreted by the Argent-Tuffen cells, is completely involved in regulating the contraction of the muscles of the stomach. Right? So they are involved in regulating the contraction of the muscles. We said there are 3 types of muscles in the muscularis of the stomach, right? The longitudinal muscles, we have the circular muscles as well as the oblique muscles. So for regulating the contraction of the muscles that are present in the muscularis region of the stomach, this serotonin plays a very important role, right? So that is the function of serotonin, which is being secreted by the fourth type of cell, which is called the Argent-Tuffen cells. Next, moving on to cell number 5. Cell number 5, what we have is called the G cells. Right, so this is cell number 5, which is called the G cells. Now, G cells actually secrete a local hormone, right? So they would secrete a local hormone, which is called as gastrin. So this is the local hormone which is being secreted. So we know what exactly hormones do, right? So hormones, actually speaking, hormones are secreted in one place and they move to the distant place where they start performing their action. But the hormone which is being secreted by the G cells, we would start calling it as a local hormone because the hormone is secreted in the stomach and it would start functioning in the stomach itself. So therefore, we will start calling it as the local hormone. Now, what is the role of gastrin? From the name itself, we can make out what would be the role of this gastrin. So the function of gastrin is to regulate the secretion of all of the cells, right? So they would start regulating the secretions of the other cells of the gastric gland. That is the role of the G cells or the gastrin, which is actually being secreted by the G cells. So G cells, they will start secreting a local hormone called as gastrin, and this gastrin is responsible for regulating the secretion of other substances from the other cells which are a part of the gastric gland. And finally, we have the last cell here, which is called the basal cell. The last type of cell is the basal cell. Right? And this basal cell, there is one more name also given for it. So you can just make a note. I'm not going to write it down here. It is also called as the stem cells. Right? Either we call it as basal cells or we call it as stem cells. Now, these basal cells or stem cells, they are actually considered as the precursors of other type of cells. Right? So they are usually considered as the precursors of the other type of cells. So that is the role of this basal cell. Now, what does this mean, precursors? If at all any of the above mentioned cells, all of these 5 types of cells, if any of those cells are damaged, or if they are dead, or if they are not functioning properly, these basal cells are the ones which would actually get transformed into those type of cells. That's the reason why we are calling them as precursors of all of the other types of cells, right? So if any of these above cells gets damaged, or if they are not functioning properly, or if they are not working efficiently, so these basal cells or the stem cells, they would actually get transformed into those types of cells, right? So all of these together, we would start calling it as the gastric gland. So all these together, all these 6 different types of cells together constitute the gastric gland, and all the secretion of all of these together, we would start calling it as the gastric juice. Now, if we have to give the composition of gastric juice, what all does the gastric juice consist of? It consists of mucus, it consists of HCl, it consists of gastric intrinsic factor, there is pepsinogen, there is prorenin, there is mild gastric lipase, there is serotonin, there is gastrin. All of these components together, we would start calling it as the gastric juice. And the pH of the gastric juice, you can just make a note of that also. pH of gastric juice is usually around 1.2 to 1.8. And that highly acidic nature of the gastric juice is because of the secretion of the hydrochloric acid from the oxymic cells. So you need to remember these secretions as well as the cells. Many a times questions have been asked based on this, mostly with regards to the match the following, right? So you need to remember what type of cells secrete what type of substances, right? Goblet cells secretes mucus, oxymic cells or parietal cells, they will secrete HCl as well as Cazel's intrinsic factor. Chief cells or zymogen cells, they will secrete pepsinogen, prorenin as well as mild gastric lipase. Then we have argentophil cells secreting serotonin. Then we have the G cells which would secrete gastrin, and then we have the basal cells which would act as the precursors of all of these types of cells, right? So composition wise, you can just make a note of that also. Composition of gastric juice, it has the mucus, the HCl, the Cazel's intrinsic factor, pepsinogen, prorenin, mild gastric lipase, serotonin, and gastrin. All of them together constitutes the gastric juice. And the pH of gastric juice usually ranges from 1.2 to 1.8. Right? So this is what we have with the next structure, which is called as the stomach. Now the food from the stomach will now enter into the next part of the alimentary canal, which is called as the small intestine, and small intestine will take it up in the next session. Right? Thank you.